Sí, molt bé. Ara sí, no? Sí.
Good afternoon. Our apologies. We just had a small technical problem, but we've already solved it. And welcome.
Benvinguts i benvingudes. If you need the English version, please click on the icon below. It's the little planet.
Good afternoon. Welcome to this new activity, this new event. We apologize for this short delay. We just had a technical problem. Thank you very much for being here with us today. Thank you, Jordi, for joining us today. We are going to have a presentation by Jordi Puig Roca, who will be telling us about the effects of climate change on agriculture in Catalonia. And he'll also tell us about the importance of agrobiodiversity in our territory. And this topic is very much aligned with the goal of Fundesplai of making people aware of these environmental and climate challenges that are associated with the food system. And we do this by organizing educational projects and events regarding sustainable food for schools and other education centers. We also have an exhibition that we open at our headquarters in Prat de Llobregat, and I will show you a short video of this exhibition afterwards. And we also organize webinars and conferences such as this one based on this topic. In fact, today's webinar is included within the Eat Life project that is funded by the EU Life program that has as a goal to meet the objectives of the farm to fork strategy. And these objectives are mainly to reduce the carbon footprint associated with the food production, making food available to everybody, and to guarantee a food system that is fair, healthy, and sustainable. Therefore, we're very happy to have with us Jordi, who is an environmentalist specialized in climate change. He has work in the area of sustainability in the public administration and is the author of several scientific papers, and he's the coordinator of SPGAN, that is a consulting agency that is specialized in climate change. Before his presentation, though, I am going to share with you this short video about our exhibition. Discover how we can change the world through food. Eat, act, impact. By the way, if you have any questions, please write them through the Q&A In the Q&A section, Jordi will answer them at the end of the presentation, and there'll also be a survey available after the presentation, and we would be very grateful if you could fill up the presentation for us. Now, Jordi, without further ado, welcome. Thank you, and good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me today to join you. I am going to try and explain the interferences of climate change and the food system, particularly with primary production. To do that, I have prepared a presentation of 35 minutes approximately, and I am going to explain first the current climate change situation, to explain also the new climate scenarios for the future. We use modeling to look at the changes in temperature and in rainfall. And then I will also focus on very key aspects, on some key aspects that have to do with irrigation and also with the production capacity of the crops based on climate change. I will start quickly with these slides. Firstly, I would like you to look around you, because if you live in Catalonia, if you look at the fields that you have near home, most of them are going from green to brown. And they're usually cereal fields, particularly wheat fields, and in spring, in April, because April is usually the rainiest month in spring and usually the third month with the most rain in the year. However, the fields in April look like the fields do in June and July. So we are suffering this water stress due to the fact that there is a scarcity of rain, with a rainfall for the last 30 months that is below average. And this is causing many production problems. And this is a warning about what the climate will be like in the future. If we pay attention to the data, we can see that in the last 50, 60 years, the temperature has been raised in 0.25 degrees centigrade every decade. And this leap started in the 60s and 70s, when there was an increase in oil consumption and in industrialization. And we should highlight that this temperature increase is not linear. For example, in Catalonia, in the mountains, there is a higher increase than on the coastal areas. And during the year, the temperature increase also takes place in specific points of time, particularly in summer. This means that in the high areas, in the mountains, it may seem that there isn't so much of a climate change. However, relatively, the increase is higher than on the coastal areas. And this is essential because it has an impact on snow and the water reservoirs in the mountains. As for the rainfall, the statistic trends weren't significant. However, in the last 3 or 4 years, there is a clear correlation between rainfall and climate change. And we can observe a reduction of 1.5 approximately of percentage of rainfall reduction per decade. This means that the annual rainfall decrease has gone down 70 millimeters compared to the rainfall in the mid-20th century. So we have a lesser capacity to have water reservoirs in the mountains. For example, the Segre River, one of the most strategic rivers for the reservoirs in the inland in Catalonia, it has reduced its flow a 40 to 60%. So we see a reduction due to these trends and also due to other factors, such as the increase of forests that don't allow water to reach the rivers and lakes. So it's a multifactorial change with many associated aspects. Between 1950 and 2021, and we have 2021 as the last year with complete data, in summer we see a higher temperature increase. That's 0.35 degrees per decade. It may not seem much, but it has a huge impact because during the hottest season, when there is less water, there is a temperature increase. I'm afraid that I cannot control very well the slides, but don't worry, I keep correcting them as I talk. As for the rainfall, we also face this same type of situation in the sense that in summer we have less water and less rainfall. And many people my age remember the summer showers that were very frequent as of August the 15th, when autumn started, more or less. The temperatures went down as from August the 15th, and showers were quite frequent. However, this is not so usual now, and this tends to happen now more in September. And of course, this means that we have two very hot summers, July and August, that are terrible for agriculture, particularly for those crops that are in dry areas. What does this mean then? Well, the current situation is complicated. This is a chart with the three scenarios that have been established internationally for the future. It's scenario RCP 8.5, RCP 6.0, and RCP 4.5 that show the quantity of energy, of heat that the planet retains, that can leave the planet through the air, and that can come back due to the climate change and CO2 and other agents that cause this rebound of radiation, because without the greenhouse gases, there wouldn't be any life on the planet. But if we have too many greenhouse gases, then there is a temperature increase. And in this first scenario, RCP 4.5 would place us in 2050 with a temperature increase of 2 degrees. I don't know whether you are aware of the last climate summits that established that the limit for the planet's safety is 2 degrees. And this scenario can vary, as we can see on this chart, and 6.0 and 8.5 scenarios have an exponential trend. Just so you understand better, the RCP 8.5 would be business as usual. If we continue with the current carbon emission trend in 2050, we would have a temperature increase of 3 degrees, and in 20, in the year 2100, it would be 5 degrees, which would be catastrophic, because with an increase of 1.5 degrees, the system is already very unstable. And there have been agreements to establish a maximum increase of 2 degrees. And the expectations by the governments establish that the ES scenario in 2050 will be between RCP 6.0 and RCP 4.5. And if there is no drastic change in the lowering of emissions, we'll be facing a very serious problem. And at the level of climate change, we have studied the 4.5 scenario, the less worst scenario, and the 8.5 worst case scenario, based on business as usual. And the idea is to be able to reach the RCP 4.5 scenario so that we can reduce the temperature before the year 2100. And in Catalonia, the situation is catastrophic for the 8.5 scenario, because there would be an increase in some areas between 3 and 5 degrees centigrade, and there would be a reduction of rainfall between 40 to 70%. This means that in 2050, the climate in Catalonia would be the same as in Northern Africa, because in the last 2 years in Barcelona, the rainfall has been very similar to that of Murcia, that is further south in Spain. And there is a difference in latitude of 500 or 600 kilometers between Barcelona and Murcia. And if we apply the worst case scenario, we would have in Catalonia the climate of Northern Africa. If we apply all these future scenarios to agriculture, we can see many different data that I will show you now. And our obsession for the last 5 years has been to be able to plan plots in a safe way for the long term, because if there's a vineyard, then the projection is for 20, 30, 50 years. And if we don't apply these future scenarios on these new vineyards, then it doesn't make any sense, because we want to know that new crops are feasible in the future. So we are combining the climate forecast with the climate data of the territory to create these models that help us interpret the behavior of crops in the future. Here we have some of the first maps that show the evolution of humidity and temperature in the territory. At the top, we see 3 maps. The first one refers to the past, the middle one to the present, and the one on the right is the map of the future up to 2050. As you can see, the hottest climates are mainly seen on the coast, and this, of course, can generate some opportunities, because citrus can be grown in these areas. Right now, they're just grown in the Ebro area or in the Delta de Llobregat, where you have your headquarters at Fundesplai. And in the future, it would be extending this hot area would be extending to other parts of Catalonia where one, for example, could grow citrus or cotton. And this red color that shows very dry areas where it would be difficult to grow some cereal is becoming larger and larger. This would be the 8.5 scenario. If we move forward and we apply these models to specific areas, this is a part of the central part of Catalonia where the winter season is quite cold. As you can see in this lighter green area, and then in the lower part, the winter is not so cold. And in the future, the hotter winter areas colonize the coldest winter areas. And this modeling enables us to create these new scenarios. And this would be the summer for this same area, this same inland area. So this is the future, and this is the current one. So we go from a typical summer, current summer, to an area that becomes much hotter. As for the rainfall, in the lower part, we see hotter areas, whereas in the northern part, the temperature is much more temperate. But you can see the difference here for 2030 and 2050. And if we look at the direct impact on the crops, the type of winter, the type of summer, and the humidity level for the crop distribution in the future, I'm afraid that the slides are not always following the right order, but I'll be controlling them. I apologize for this, but here you can see, for example, how we can be using irrigation, and also how vineyards cannot be grown, for example, in the Penedès area in the future. Without water, the production in the Penedès area will be complicated, and it's important to plan this because in the next 10-20 years, they'll have to change some of the varieties of the vineyards. Here on this slide, we see other examples of some of the varieties we have created models for. We can see the distribution from a system that is an irrigation system to a different type of system depending on the climate evolution. You can see here the changes in these areas. They used to be areas with a high level of rainfall. Now there's no rainfall, and therefore they need irrigation. These models are very effective to be able to plan new crops, and it gives us an idea. También nos da una idea de cómo será nuestra seguridad alimentaria en un futuro, ¿de acuerdo? And it gives an idea about food safety. I'm now giving you the example of spelt, an ancient cereal that is quite resilient. Y es bastante rústica. Pues en este caso, fijaros que aquí, in this case, when we do the distribution changes, spelt shows few changes because this area is relatively damp. So in some of the areas in the inland, there are not showing many distribution changes. However, if we look at irrigation varieties such as beans, we may see many changes or no changes at all. For example, here with beans in this area, apparently there are no changes between the current and future scenarios. Why? Because these are very water demanding varieties. However, when we apply the gross irrigation needs, that is the amount of water needed for production, then the changes are very significant. Therefore, what I'm saying is that we can see with these models the potential distribution of these crops, and then we'll look at how much water is necessary to maintain the crops in the same area. Here we have olive trees. This is another clear example of a stable distribution in this area, but there are also some red areas where the crops cannot grow. However, in the future, they will be feasible. So this means that there are no further areas of ice. So this is worth mentioning because in some mountain areas, climate change creates new scenarios, new opportunities. And these opportunities usually are associated with water. We cannot create new crops in certain areas, even if they are mountain areas, if we have no water available. And now, let me explain the irrigation needs, the gross irrigation needs. These are the most important maps. But firstly, I'd like to share with you this variety distribution map. For example, the Penedès area, a vineyard area in the center of Catalonia. I mentioned that there are different options. One option is to use irrigation to give each crop the amount of water required, and the other option is to adapt the varieties. And in these maps, we can see how the suitability of varieties will change. The red areas will be vineyard varieties for very dry areas. Then we have the other areas in orange for the French varieties, and the purple areas would be for varieties usually grown in the south of Spain. So in the Penedès area in Catalonia, there is a striking change from the Catalan and French varieties to a situation today where the varieties that suffer more from water stress are excluded, and then we end up in the future with a scenario where only the varieties such as Monastrell that are typical from the south of Spain or from the south of Catalonia even. This is a key aspect in the sense that we need to be able to work with all these variables and options by diversifying the crops or trying to make the water available to the vineyards so that we can preserve some of the varieties. But even with irrigation, they may have trouble to grow properly. If we look at the gross irrigation requirements, I am showing you here the Priorat area in Catalonia, a wine growing area where in the north and on the perimeters, they can use both the dry crops and irrigated crops, because here we need to measure the quantity of water required per square meter by each variety. And in the south, on the border with the Ebro River, then the water requirements are much higher than in the northern part. However, with the change of the climate scenario, the water requirements increase in every part of this map, particularly in the Siurana area in the center, where there is virtually no rainfall in summer. And if we compare this to the previous map, we'll see that the suitability of some of the varieties may be feasible in some areas, but if we look at the water requirements, it is clear that it will be necessary to water those varieties, because if not, the wine quality will be affected or the production will be very low. So we need to have the perspective of water consumption to know whether we'll have the economic capacity to produce as much as is needed. This is a comparative chart of 3 different grape varieties. We'll start with the black Grenache. It's very typical for this area. And in the future scenarios, the water requirements, the irrigation requirements are very high, and it can be up to 3,000 cubic meters per hectare and year in the hottest areas. And if we look at the rest of the varieties,
perdón, aquí se me han colado estas dos. Las voy a poner más abajo.
For instance,
que si las comparamos con
the Cariñena grape variety, that's also very important in this area.
Importante en la zona. También podemos ver
the water requirements are slightly lower versus the black Grenache and half of the Monastril requirements. So in the very dry areas where the possibility of irrigation is very limited, the only solution will be to replace the grape varieties grown. So there are several options, and of course, there are some other possibilities, such as using other local varieties that are more adapted, and managing the soil properly is also important by using different types of vegetable covers or pruning the vineyards more frequently. But at the end of the day, if the water balance is as expected in these scenarios, no matter how well we manage the varieties, their production will be limited. For example, last week I was
pasada hablaba con
discussing with a colleague
me decía que
the situation of some very old vineyards of 70, 80 years, and they're dying this year. They started dying last year.
este año
Many of the vineyards died last year, and now in spring, many more are dying. And it's very likely that this very old vineyards won't be able to produce any grapes. Therefore, the variety replacement will probably take place more quickly than expected. This is what I mentioned before about spelt, which apparently in the center of this territory didn't show any changes. But if we look at the water requirements in the future, it's much, much higher. And this variable is very important because it has a direct impact on production. And if we can see this lack of water, we will see also a reduction of kilos of grapes produced or cereal or other cereal. For example, in the case of wheat, we have looked at different parameters, mainly the rainfall and the capacity of soil to retain water, and that has allowed us to create wheat production charts that vary according to each scenario. And in this case, in the case of wheat, we have seen how in the 4.5 scenario, there is already a production decrease of 20 to 30%, and in the 8.5 scenario, the production decrease is of up to 60%. This means that the situation will be very complicated because Catalonia until recently was a privileged territory because it just had an appropriate rainfall and with adequate temperatures for cereal and with good yield in some specific areas. Generally speaking, the production was quite feasible. However, in these future scenarios, we're seeing how this reduction in production from 20 to 60% means that we have to look at other alternatives or situations to be solved. Firstly, can we continue producing cereal in such a massive way to continue maintaining the current industrial model with the current pig farms, for example? And if we cannot produce any cereal and we don't have any water for the crops, what are the alternatives? Well, there are some alternatives, but they require systems that combine fields with grass fields, with forests, and with cattle that is better adapted, because in many areas of the country, we mainly have cows in the grass fields. But in this future, we are considering in the hinterland, the best cattle will be sheep and goats because they need fewer resources and they are better adapted to the future climate. And We also think it's important to recover some areas where the trees will be generating nutrients and uptaking water and protecting the temperature of the soil. So in the future, the strategies to maintain the crops in many areas that will become dry, arid in the future, and then we will have to apply the models that are used in agriculture in the south of Spain. That means having permanent fields and a very accurate management of all of the factors in the territory involved in the production. So I have covered all the topics that I wanted to share with you. And now if you have any questions, I'll be very happy to answer them. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Jordi. Don't worry about the order of the slides because you have been controlling them perfectly well. Thank you for your presentation. It's very relevant to the current situation in Catalonia, where the water dams are dry, and now there is now a new type of tourism, drought tourism. The situation is very critical, and you have explained very well all the implications. We have some questions. And the first two questions are quite similar, and they refer to the worst case scenario, RCP 8.5, where there is this water stress that you have described so well, apart from trying to maintain some of the current crops by increasing irrigation. Will there be new varieties outside grapes that can be used, other varieties of other products that can be more resilient, and new varieties that can be used in the future for the new crops? Well, yes, we are working not just with grapes, but also with other products to create varieties that are resistant to drought. However, the solution is not replacing the varieties we have with others in the future. The main question is whether our current economic and agriculture model can continue as we see now, because if we think about vineyards, the Penedès area is focused on the production of wine and cava. And if we decide to introduce new varieties or create micro irrigation systems for some areas, this will not guarantee, however, that the wine industry can continue in the future, because the quality of the grape will be very different, and the new varieties may not allow the production of cava, a very important product for the Penedès area. So we're not just referring to changes of crops. We should think about changing the agricultural system so they can be resilient to climate change. So that's why we need three main pillars: extensive cattle, forestry, and also permanent grass fields. I'm not saying that the whole of the Catalonia territory should be like the Extremadura territory. However, in the Penedès area and in the Priorat area, I am sure that there'll be new crops such as pistachios or some types of cactuses such as aloe vera for the cosmetic industry and also for the food industry, and in areas where there is a scarcity of water, then we can have some other types of products, or in areas where there's water, we can even have subtropical crops such as avocados or mangoes. It will all depend on the availability of water. And all of this will be associated with the fact that we need more resilient systems. And you mean then that we can have more agro-environmental systems? In fact, there is a question about this, although there's another question before that, because if it's impossible to grow crops in dry areas and water is needed for irrigation, where can water be obtained from? Well, irrigation water is usually obtained from the reservoirs that are in the Ebro River and in the inland. And it's possible that some areas won't be appropriate for some cereal like wheat, but they can be good for the production of other products such as forage that can be used as food for animals, as animal feed. And there are other areas where cereal will still be grown. However, we need to manage very efficiently the water and the soil. Therefore, we need to be aware of the capacity of these systems to produce grain and fodder for animals, and we need to find other crops that are more focused on human food and not so much on animal feed. And then the cattle should be an extensive type of cattle.
Vale, perfecto. Gracias, Jordi.
And are you aware whether there are any laws to control the use of water, taking into consideration these new scenarios? Well, we do have a drought decree that regulates water consumption in the homes, in the industry, and in agriculture, and it reduces water consumption according to the water available. But this is an emergency measure. This is not a water management policy in the mid or long term. A mid-term water management strategy would be eliminating some of the flooding irrigation areas in Lleida, so that we have laws that promote the efficiency of irrigation. For example, there should be a maximum amount of irrigation per area. This is something that could be established by law. It could be regulated by law. And in this way, there would be a change in the use of water. And there would be many more resources for rivers to have water and also to water new areas with more efficient systems. At the end of the day, the laws could be regulating even more the water management so that there's a better use of water, both in the homes and in the industry, and particularly in agriculture, because agriculture uses 80% of the water available. And farmers are already preparing themselves for the scenarios that you have described. And if so, how? You have mentioned this question during your presentation, but maybe you can give us more information about how they're preparing themselves. Well, farmers, generally speaking, the small farms have difficulties to prepare themselves, and they're just facing on a daily basis these situations, all the scenarios I have described are being analyzed by large companies and by the public administrations. However, the small farmers have limited resources, and some are changing some of their crops, but in Lleida, in the irrigation areas, instead of corn, they are going to be planting another type of cereal because of the lack of water. So they will have to plant sorghum instead of wheat. So you're talking about emergency measures here. Yes, exactly. Well, thank you very much, Jordi. And I'd like to thank all the participants as well for joining us and for their questions. And we'll meet you in the next webinar. And on Thursday, we'll be talking about school agro-environmental topics that will be very interesting. Thank you.